Late November 1944, a U.S.-run POW transit camp near Liège, Belgium. The morning air hung cold and still, touched by the faint smell of wet canvas and engine oil drifting from the motor pool. Beyond the roll call square, rows of frost-covered barracks stood quiet, their metal chimneys releasing thin trails of smoke into a pale sky. A column of German female auxiliaries, exhausted, mud-stained, and carrying what little they owned, was led through the gates under the watch of American military police. Most were Wehrmacht Schelferinnen, communications operators, and clerks who had marched for days to avoid Soviet lines before finally surrendering to the Americans. Fear clung to them heavier than the winter coats they no longer had. They expected harshness, punishment, or immediate labor assignments, everything they had been warned about in endless propaganda sessions back home. But as they entered the supply depot, they froze. Inside, neatly stacked on long wooden tables, lay piles of clean clothing, shirts, jackets, trousers, coats, mostly American fatigues in various sizes. A calm-faced U.S. quartermaster sergeant stood beside them, clipboard in hand. He simply pointed toward the tables and said, in slow, clear English, "Pick whichever uniform fits you best." The women stared, unable to understand how a war built on brutality could lead them to this unexpected moment of quiet humanity. The arrival of German female prisoners in American hands during late 1944 came at a moment when the war in Europe was moving toward its final, brutal phase. The Allied advance across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands had pushed German forces in a steady retreat, creating chaotic collapses along logistical and administrative lines. Among the units swept up in this turmoil were thousands of women serving in the German armed forces, not in combat roles, but in the essential networks that kept the Wehrmacht functioning. These women belonged largely to the Wehrmacht Schelferinnen system, a broad category of auxiliaries trained in communications, clerical work, meteorology, anti-aircraft operations, transport coordination, and field hospitals. Many were young, some barely 20, drawn into service through a mix of patriotic pressure, wartime necessity, and the restrictive culture of the Nazi state. Indoctrination had shadowed their training, lectures warning them that capture by the Allies meant humiliation, abuse, or worse. In every camp and barracks, posters and instructors repeated the same message: the enemy shows no mercy. For many of them, surrender was not a simple act of giving up arms. It was stepping into a future they had been taught to fear. By late 1944, as German command structures broke apart and retreating formations lost contact with their superiors, groups of female auxiliaries began appearing along rural roads and shattered towns, seeking shelter or attempting to rejoin units that no longer existed. Some were caught in the path of the U.S. First and Third Armies as they advanced through Belgium and Luxembourg. Others were found in signal stations, field hospitals, or abandoned headquarters. When U.S. forces took custody of these women, they followed procedures shaped by the 1929 Geneva Convention, which the United States had ratified and integrated into its War Department regulations. The American approach to prisoners, male or female, was guided by the principle that humane treatment reduced resistance, prevented escapes, and maintained order. But the War Department faced an unusual challenge. The system had extensive policies for handling male POWs, but very little precedent for managing female enemy personnel captured in large numbers. At first, the women were placed in temporary holding areas near frontline supply hubs. These sites were designed for short-term intake, not long-term accommodation. The priority was always the same: disarm them, register them, provide medical screenings, and stabilize their conditions before transfer to established internment facilities. American officers quickly realized that clothing would become a significant logistical issue. Many of the women had marched for days in the same uniforms, some designed only for office work, others worn thin by hard service. Several reported frostbite, blisters, and untreated infections. Winter was intensifying, and the front offered little comfort. American quartermasters were responsible for maintaining strict inventory over captured material and issued supplies. But the U.S. military did not carry stocks of German women's uniforms, nor did they have female-patterned clothing within their own supply depots. Regulations required POWs to be provided with clean, serviceable garments to prevent disease and maintain hygiene. Yet in this case, the only available solution was to use the standard American uniform inventory designed for men. This decision, though born from necessity, would become one of the most unexpected moments for many German women taken into custody. In their minds, uniforms were symbols of authority, hierarchy, and gender roles deeply rooted in German military culture. To be allowed to step out of their issued garments they believed they would be forced to wear indefinitely, was not something they could have imagined. As the number of surrendered German auxiliaries increased, the U.S. Army was forced to bring order to a situation that had developed more rapidly than anyone in Washington or the European theater of operations had anticipated. Standard POW camps were built to handle tens of thousands of male soldiers, but these new arrivals required adjustments to existing procedures. Commanders needed to ensure compliance with the Geneva Convention, maintain security, and uphold sanitary conditions, all while managing shortages in transport, personnel, and winter equipment. The American solution was methodical. Female POWs were segregated into designated compounds within larger camps, often repurposed sections of barracks originally intended for clerks or supply workers. The goal was not special treatment, but strategic organization. Placing women among male POWs created risks of disorder, disputes, and logistical complications. By late 1944, the U.S. Army had established separate women's sections inside camps across Belgium, Luxembourg, and eventually within occupied Germany itself. These facilities were operated under the authority of the Provost Marshal General's office, whose wartime directives were clear. Every POW, regardless of rank or gender, was entitled to basic humane conditions. This included adequate clothing. The War Department had already faced similar challenges earlier in the war while managing Italian and North African prisoners, and they drew from that experience. Yet those groups consisted overwhelmingly of men, and therefore the uniform problem had never been as pronounced. To understand why uniform selection became so significant, it helps to consider the broader logistical environment. By late 1944, U.S. supply lines were extended across hundreds of miles of liberated territory. Everything, from blankets to boots to medical equipment, had to be transported from depots in Normandy, Cherbourg, or Antwerp, then distributed carefully to prevent waste. Quartermaster depots maintained meticulous accountability for items, especially clothing. But even with such systems in place, the sheer scale of operations meant shortages were common. Combat troops always received priority, followed by essential support personnel. POWs ranked below them. The unexpected influx of female prisoners created a bottleneck. American logisticians quickly noted the lack of appropriate garments. Many captured women wore wool skirts and blouses. Some carried only summer uniforms, and others wore damaged or incomplete clothing from months of retreat. Cold weather required additional layers, but there were no spare sets of German women's uniforms in American depots. The alternative, forcing women to continue wearing soiled, torn, or inadequate clothing, violated health standards and risked outbreaks of disease, particularly lice and respiratory illnesses. Thus, commanders authorized the issue of standard-issue garments drawn from U.S. Army stocks. These were men's field jackets, fatigues, wool trousers, and undershirts. They were durable, warm, and already cataloged for distribution. Yet issuing them created another problem: fit. Men's clothing hanging awkwardly on women risked discomfort, reduced mobility, and increased the likelihood of injuries. Furthermore, ill-fitting garments could cause practical issues during work details or physical routines inside the camp. To minimize waste and ensure each prisoner received properly fitting garments, quartermasters were instructed to allow POWs to select their own sizes. The directive was simple: lay the available items on tables by category and size, escort the prisoners in small groups, and let them choose within the limits of inventory. This method also sped up distribution, as the usual American practice of measuring or fitting each POW individually would have required significantly more personnel. For the Americans, the process was nothing extraordinary, a practical way to solve a supply issue. But for the German women, it was a revelation. The act of choosing, especially within a military environment, contradicted almost everything they had experienced under the Third Reich. Nazi ideology had praised rigidity, obedience, and uniformity. Women in auxiliary service were expected to follow orders immediately and without question. Even in benign settings, personal choice was limited. In military situations, it was nearly non-existent. Inside the POW camps, the American insistence on hygiene and order created an atmosphere completely different from the harsh images painted by Nazi propaganda. Physicians conducted routine medical checks. Red Cross inspectors documented conditions. Chaplains and morale officers occasionally visited the compounds. These practices emphasized procedure over punishment. To the prisoners, many of whom had spent years under strict discipline and ideological pressure, the environment felt strangely structured, yet comparatively humane. The uniform selection process became a symbolic moment in this larger context. Some women hesitated, unsure whether it was a trick or a test. Others approached the tables reluctantly, touching the fabric with uncertainty. A few broke down in tears, overwhelmed by the contrast between expectation and reality. American personnel often interpreted these reactions as simple exhaustion. Few understood the depth of the cultural and psychological shift occurring before them. This moment, quiet, procedural, seemingly mundane, marked the beginning of a profound psychological adjustment. It was the first tangible indication that their world had changed, that the authority they once served was collapsing, and that the enemy they had been taught to fear operated under principles both foreign and deeply unsettling. From this foundation, a more complex picture began to emerge. A picture shaped not only by logistical necessity, but by the human responses it triggered within the walls of the POW compounds. Angle 1. The human angle. Shock, relief, and confusion for the German women who entered American custody. The most striking aspect of their new reality was the emotional whiplash that followed their capture. Many had spent months living under constant threat. Bombings, retreats, shortages, and the looming presence of collapsing German lines. Surrender had not brought relief. It had intensified their fear. They expected to be shouted at, forced into grueling labor, or stripped of dignity in ways reinforced by years of propaganda. Instead, the environment they encountered was controlled but calm. The guards were alert but not threatening. The procedures firm yet predictable. The uniform selection moment, so simple from the American perspective, became an emotional flashpoint. Women who had lived under rigid command structures found themselves confronted with a gesture that, though practical, felt personal. Some approached the tables with caution. Others froze, unable to decide whether they were permitted to act freely. A few whispered to each other in disbelief, wondering whether there would be consequences for choosing incorrectly. For many, the shock stemmed from the realization that their captors saw them not as ideological enemies, but as individuals who needed clothing before winter deepened. That single experience began to erode years of imposed beliefs. Quiet acts of humanity carried more weight than extended lectures could have. The gesture challenged their assumptions, raised new questions, and forced them to reconsider everything they had believed about the opposing side. And as the women carried their chosen garments back to the barracks, the emotional landscape of captivity began to reshape itself, slowly, subtly, and in ways none of them could have anticipated when the war was still raging outside the camp gates. Angle 2. The cultural angle. German militarism meets American practicality. The uniform selection incident brought two very different cultures into direct contact. German military structure, even for its auxiliary units, placed tremendous emphasis on hierarchy, discipline, and strict conformity. Uniforms represented more than clothing. They signified rank, duty, and ideological alignment. Women in service were taught to treat their attire with seriousness. Every button, fold, and insignia reflected the authority of the state they served. Even after surrender, many clung to their uniforms as symbols of structure in a world collapsing around them. American military culture, though disciplined, had a more pragmatic streak. The U.S. Army valued efficiency, adaptability, and problem-solving. Where German procedure favored rigidity, American systems often emphasized function over form. When confronted with the challenge of clothing thousands of female POWs, American quartermasters saw only the logistical solution: provide what was available, ensure it fit, and keep the process orderly. The idea that this practical approach could carry deeper emotional weight simply did not enter their calculations. For the prisoners, this difference in mentality proved startling. Allowing them to choose their own garments signaled a level of autonomy rarely encountered in German service. The act broke unspoken rules about obedience and uniformity. It also revealed a cultural divide in how authority was expressed and perceived. Many POWs later spoke of their surprise at how the Americans issued orders, firmly, but without the rigid authoritarian tone they associated with German officers. The uniform tables, therefore, became more than a logistical station. They became a point of cultural confrontation, one that exposed the gulf between the totalitarian state they had served and the democratic army that now held them. Angle 3. The psychological angle. How small freedoms undermined Nazi conditioning. Years of propaganda had shaped the mental world of the German auxiliaries. They were taught to fear Allied troops, to expect degradation and cruelty, and to view the American military as a threat to their safety and identity. Nazi indoctrination had been thorough, especially in auxiliary schools where political lectures accompanied technical training. These women had been told repeatedly that the enemy saw them as enemies and as women, making their position doubly dangerous. In this psychological landscape, captivity was supposed to be a place of terror. Instead, it became a place of contradictions. The Americans did not fit the image created by Nazi rhetoric. They maintained strict order, but not brutality. They enforced procedures, but not arbitrary punishment. This gap between expectation and reality destabilized established mental frameworks. The uniform selection moment accelerated this process. It represented a level of respect and acknowledgement of personal agency that clashed with the narrative the women had been taught. Being allowed to choose, even from limited options, signaled that their captors viewed them as capable of rational decision-making, not merely as defeated enemies to be controlled. This subtle shift carried profound impact. Some prisoners experienced a quiet internal conflict: loyalty to the regime they had served versus the reality of humane treatment from the side they had been taught to fear. Others felt a sense of emotional release, relief that the war for them no longer held the same personal threat. The human mind, conditioned by fear, reacts strongly to unexpected kindness. In the controlled world of a POW camp, such moments became transformative. A new psychological landscape emerged, one shaped not by ideology, but by lived experience. Angle 4. The gender angle. Expectations of humiliation versus the reality of procedure. One of the most powerful elements shaping the women's reactions was gender expectation. In Nazi Germany, women in uniform were often treated as auxiliaries, not as equals to male soldiers. They were bound by strict codes of conduct and were taught that Allied capture posed particular danger to them. Female prisoners were supposedly at risk of humiliation or abuse, messages reinforced relentlessly by German officers and propaganda units. When the women entered American custody, these fears intensified. Many expected to be stripped of dignity, treated harshly, or used for menial labor without regard for their well-being. Yet what they found was an environment where gender did matter, but not in the way they had been told. American regulations required female POWs to receive privacy in barracks, separate washing facilities, and controlled visitation by guards. The procedures were rooted less in chivalry and more in the desire to prevent accusations, abuses, or conflicts. The uniform selection moment became a focal point of this gender dynamic. Clothing distribution could have been an opportunity for humiliation, but instead it was structured, orderly, and free of spectacle. Guards maintained distance. Quartermasters focused on efficiency. No comments were made about appearance or background. For many women, this professionalism felt surprising, even disorienting. The realization that they were being treated according to formal standards, rather than assumptions about their gender, shattered many fears. It revealed an American military culture that viewed them not as ideological symbols or gender vulnerabilities, but as POWs entitled to specific protections. That discovery reshaped the emotional atmosphere of captivity and influenced how they understood both their captors and the broader conflict.